we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, let us know, or hit us up for any reason. Check us out on Instagram or Twitter at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast. Again, we always want to hear if you want a new show, if you want to hear a new topic, or come on the show, or be a guest, or whatever it might be. Always feel free to reach out to us there. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight. If you ever did want to donate to the podcast, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. And yeah, if you ever, if you do have the chance, please share the podcast. I mean, you know, we always want to grow and grow our audience, but if you know anyone who you think would appreciate the show, just let them know we're here and send them our way. Anyway, thanks again for being here. I'm really excited for today's episode because I've been listening to this podcast for a while, and you know, I always like to be the meta podcast about a podcast. And this it's a newer pod. I mean, I guess any podcast is fairly new, generally speaking. But this one only came out a couple years ago. Well, 3 years ago, I guess. Anyway. And it was suggested to me from one of my coworkers, Pat at work there. Shout out Pat, Patty Wynn Williams, P-Dubs. He thought I would like the podcast, and he was right on. It's super interesting. Lot of interesting ways the podcast itself is presented, and then the topics are also really interesting too. And the podcast we're talking about is called Blowback. It's really interesting. It started in 2020. I almost said 2000. Oh my God. Started in 2020, and it's about American history and foreign policy. So it's referring to like modern American history. You know, it's not like going too far back, but it's hosted by Noah Kulwin and Brendan James. And again, the topics that they kind of go to are topical in the sense that they kind of happened within many of our lifetimes, at least. I mean, you know, maybe some of our older listeners, definitely in your lifetimes, but it, you know, more or less kind of covers from the 80s to today, because there's a lot that happened in that time. And it's actually really interesting. I find now when we're looking back at this history, which, you know, I mean, 1983 is pushing 40 years ago. So that's a good chunk of time where a lot of things can historically happen. And the technology has been fairly solid from 1983 to today, as far as recording equipment. And I mean, only as time goes on, like with the invention of the cell phone and all this footage everywhere, you're going to have recreations of things almost to the dot. In fact, my buddy B-Rai was in town, and we were just chilling one night and decided to put on Pearl Jam live at Joe Louis Arena before they tore it down. That was in 2014, I believe. And Brian and I went to that show, and we were actually there. And I've had the bootleg, because Pearl Jam's really good. Like I believe they themselves somehow in the band, or maybe like one of like the fan club members is like responsible for like creating a bootleg, which I'm pretty sure is just like directly recorded off Pearl Jam's board, and then they actually sell it. So I bought the bootleg, and it's great. And when we watched this, like I happened to just look it up on YouTube, figuring that they were just going to have, who knows what they're going to have. Even if they're just going to have the music alone, I would have put it on just for chilling. But when we ended up putting it on, it was basically like almost every song for sure, and some of the banter in between was covered by someone that, like, must have got in there with a camera or like some kind of recording device. I mean, it was 2014. A lot of the the phone cameras weren't like amazing yet, but there were a lot of those like kind of like little handheld recorders and things like that. So I feel like a bunch of people, and whoever made this video edited all this film together and cut it and filled the time and basically, again, created this whole basically start to finish video of this Pearl Jam concert. So again, you're going to start to see, I feel, historically speaking, you're going to start to see other events potentially recreated and sewn together to kind of create a little bit more of like an accurate picture of some of these things that have happened, again, where people are able to record with their own devices. Super interesting. We'll see how that goes. A little bit like Minority Report-esque, Big Brother-ish. Anyway, back to Blowback. The format is interesting. So there's been 4 seasons so far, and there's 10 shows per season. Each episode is 60 minutes. Except in the bonus seasons, they kind of have like shorter eps. I'll get to that in a second. But like throughout the main body of the show, the kind of like meat and potatoes, they're always like playing like really cool clips from news sources and news stories and interviews from press conferences and things like that, and film clips, and even satirical skits in in the first season anyway. They kind of like went away from that in subsequent seasons, but they got John H. Benjamin, I think. Anyway, the dude who does like Bob's Burgers and Archer, they had him act in a skit, and he played Saddam Hussein in a skit, which is hilarious because the first season, which I'll get to, was about the Iraq War, and it, of course, involves Saddam Hussein heavy. And then interviews are kind of involved, but they're a little bit more involved in the bonus episodes. So, like I said, there's 10 episodes per season, but there's also like these bonus episodes, which are, usually about half hour to an hour, and there are another 10 kind of like little tidbits and little, tying up some loose ends here or there, or, some new information maybe came to light, or again, presenting some of these like more interviews. And even in later seasons too, they kind of incorporate that more into the main body. And it's cool with the bonus content. I think you look to other historical podcasts like Dan Carlin's Hardcore History. He kind of does the same idea where, it takes so long to put all this information together, and the stuff is fairly current and not crazy topical, but relatively current. There's probably some new information that comes to light all the time, where they can kind of, amend some of their information. So really, really interesting approach to it. And again, 4 seasons in so far. So they started in 2020 with season 1, and they were looking at the Iraq War, again, Saddam Hussein, all the stuff with the Bushes, really interesting stuff. Like, again, I could probably do a podcast on each topic that they go over, because and they're so didactic in their approach. They're just like really spot on. And really well researched, and it's just really solid listening and super informative. So yeah, the first season covers the Iraq War, and again, like they intersperse these like little clips from movies and stuff like that, like little pop culture references here and there, which I think are hilarious. And again, obviously doing so much with the Bushes, you kind of forget how involved they were with global politics and the ins and outs of modern American history. Really interesting. Season 2 came out in 2021. It's about the Cuban Revolution, about America's involvement in Cuba, kind of pre and post revolution, and about the Cuban Missile Crisis and stuff like that. And that was a really interesting season, at least for me, because I had read this book called Havana Nocturne, which is really, really interesting book. It's No, I almost said H. John Benjamin again. H. John Benjamin, not John H. Benjamin. TJ something. Anyway, the author of Havana Nocturne talks about the mob involvement in pre-revolution Cuba and just the major imperialist tentacles that kind of spread across the world, really, from America. That, again, the Cuban Revolution and the Fidel government, and the Castro government, I should say, railed against and saw as a major threat, and then aligned with Russia and the Cuban Missile Crisis and Bay of Pigs, and all that crazy stuff went down. So really interesting. Like I said, I could go in ad nauseum on each one, but the way the hosts kind of present things, it's informative. It's just like exciting, right? Like they do a really good job. They seem really interested. They're funny. They're pretty witty. They're a little bit dry. And I will admit, they kind of, I guess, maybe lean right in some ways, but generally speaking, they're pretty neutral in their presentation. Season 3, which is the season I'm listening to right now, which is amazing. Oh, by the way, these are all available on Spotify. They kind of do a subscription model for their current season, and then once that's all said and done, they put everything up for free on Spotify. There's just some ads, so you can check out all the other seasons. But currently, season 4 is in full swing. But season 3, it was talking about the Korean War, which another really interesting topic. From my standpoint, anyway, I really don't know too much about the Korean War. They do call it the Forgotten War. Canada was involved, and it was heavy duty fighting. Really, really crazy stuff went down. A lot of American involvement in kind of what became, South Korea, and then obviously the split of North Korea. And generally, like I said, I won't go into it too far, but generally speaking, the U.S. were the ones who kind of decided where the border of North and South Korea is because they just fucking decided that's where they're going to do it. And there's a lot of just maybe carelessness. And again, part of some of the imperialist moves that the U.S. started to make kind of post World War II. And then season 4, which, like I said, is in full swing, is focusing on the American involvement in Afghanistan, and specifically Operation Cyclone, so the Afghanistan war was, I guess, early mid 90s. And Operation Cyclone was the CIA program to arm and finance the Afghan mujahideen. So super interesting the way kind of all the seasons have a little bit of a tie together, and I wonder if there's an overarching plan for what the hosts want to do, as far as, are they really going to tie everything together? Is it really something that's kind of why they're picking these topics in the first place, that they're going to either make a strong effort, because they allude to other seasons and certain players that exist in other series. Like, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people that were involved in the first episode about the Iraq War. I'm sure there's going to be a lot involved with Afghanistan and Blowback. Again, it's all about the the definition of blowback is it's a CIA word, I believe, but it's the unintended consequences of their actions or their initiatives or whatever kind of spookery that they're kind of taking out on people or taking part in. So the title is very apt. It makes perfect sense. But again, I wonder if they're going to make like a big, this is how everything fits together thing, or again, they just leave that up to the listener and they kind of allude to it and we kind of have to put the pieces together. You do kind of have to, be interested in this stuff and be an attentive listener, obviously, it being a podcast and, it being heavy information. information heavy podcast. But just fantastic. Again, the way it's presented is fun, and they use a lot of like a lot of the sounds that they use regularly come from great movies like Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying About the Bomb. Anyway, super interesting. Just, it at least from my side, I feel like there's some alignment in some of their interests. Anyway, and again, my buddy Pat at work, he is like, seems to be kind of like at least skewing down being someone who has a shared interest. I don't know. That was a really roundabout way of saying like we probably like the same things. So again, thanks again, Pat. Wonderful recommendation. Patty dubs. But again, it kind of opens up a little bit more of a thought in my mind about history in general. There's always a great line in the Da Vinci Code where Sophie Neveu's character is talking about that she hates history and she hates studying. She thinks it's bullshit and boring and useless. We need to be focused on science and looking forward. And Robert Langdon says no one hates history. They hate their own history. It's a cool line. It's a great line. Doesn't necessarily 100% make sense here, but again, some people aren't as interested in history, but I think it's so fascinating. I think it's so important. And again, I think the disinterest in history might also coincide with just the general disinterest of tradition, right? And I think that history really helps us stay rooted in that tradition, or at least understand where a lot of things do come from, right? Because we have a lot of questioners, right? Like the new generation are questioning a lot of what's happening right now. They're questioning the system. They're questioning everything around them. And if you don't really have a lot of answers, they're really apt to move on and think that there's going to be something better. Now, that being said, they're also really, the youngsters, I'm also including myself in this in some ways. If I hear a good reason for something why we're going to do it, or again, a history and a rich story behind something, I will respect that. But I'm not just going to do some shit for just doing shit's sake, right? So again, I think history really helps us understand a lot of tradition that way. But again, history is amazing because again, you can start looking at history if you look at it in some ways, archaeology is a form of history, right? Like, but you're looking at kind of prehistoric things, right? Literally. But again, you can look at classical history, you can look at medieval history, all through all the eras, and have a whole lifetime of study, right? And it's not like you don't even have to study all of time. You can just like take a few hundred years and study those and be an expert in that. But you don't even have to go back that far. Like I said, the topics covered on this podcast don't really go back much than Korean War, obviously. But that is an interesting setup into like how they're talking about now, and just how foreign policy was developed with Americans in a lot of these nations, and they just kind of went in and threw their weight around, because that's just what Americans do, and that's just how they do it, right? Like versus British colonialism, where they kind of went in and it was brutal, but it was polite. And, they came in and served everyone tea and then took away all their rights. So not that it was acceptable, but again, everyone has a different approach. Genghis Khan went in there and just started chopping heads. So let's just say things have evolved over the years. But again, even just modern history alone, you don't have to go very far. You don't have to go very far back to get into the juicy stuff too, right? Especially American history, right? Like, 1776 or whatever, when they signed the Declaration of Independence or whatever when Independence Day was. Like, that's, it's pushing like 350 years ago or whatever, right? So, I guess, I don't know. I fucking suck at math. Anywho, so, but it's not a really old country, right? But a lot of that history is like so interesting, and again, their involvement just on the national stage is even more interesting, and I'm super excited to keep hearing all the new topics and hearing the new season. And again, I know I peddle my Patreon here, but I put the podcast up for free. I don't expect anyone to pay that to listen to the podcast. It's only an option if you feel like I'm good, putting on a good enough show that you feel like you want to donate something. Patreon's there, but and some bonus content, hopefully. But again, the way that Blowback does it is that their current season, you just have to pay a subscription. I don't exactly know how much it is. They have their own website, but if not, you just wait a little bit and they put it up on Spotify. So I'm going to be a toot, as my favorite podcast, the History Hyenas, used to talk about their fans that didn't pay for their Patreon, the History Hyenas Patreon. They called them toots, prostitutes, because they didn't pay and they just listened. So it was a dumb analogy, but I'm a toot for the Blowback kids. So I'm just going to wait till it comes out. Again, still steeped in season 3 right now. I don't know fuck all about Korea, and honestly, I have to listen to this. I think I'm going to have to listen to this season more than once, because it's really, really, really information heavy. Just about all the stuff that happened in just like the entire Korean peninsula, what happened in the civil side of things, Japanese influence, Chinese influence, fucking nuts shit happened. Like, again, talk about Dan Carlin. He does a really interesting history of all the things that happened over hundreds of years in China, the history of how they kind of came to be. So pretty rich, pretty heavy duty, pretty sassy, molassy history, really, if you ask me, over there. And again, super interesting, and the land of the rising sun. Anyway, super interesting podcast. Check it out, Blowback. It's on Spotify. I'm pretty sure Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to your podcast. Just like us. Check us out. Check us out wherever you listen to your podcast. Tell your friends. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe and like the channel. Or sorry, subscribe to the channel, like the video. Again, thank you so much for being here. It could have been anywhere in the world, and you chose to be here with us, even if I'm just on in the background. Hello, I'm in the background. Anyway, love you all. Patreon, like us, share, YouTubes. Love y'all. Peace.